Section 22 of Aesthetic as Science of Expression and General Linguistic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Lisa Reichert. Aesthetic as Science of Expression and General Linguistic by Benedetto Croce. Translated by Douglas Ainslie. Historical Summary Part 4. Wolfgang Goethe, in 1798, forgetting the juvenile period, during which he had dared to raise a hymn to Gothic architecture, now began seriously to seek a middle term between beauty and expression. He believed that he had found it in certain characteristic contents presenting to the artist beautiful shapes, which the artist would then develop and reduce to perfect beauty. Thus for Goethe at this period, the characteristic was simply the starting point or framework from which the beautiful arose through the power of the artist. But these writers mentioned after J.B. Vico are not true philosophers. Winckelmann, Mengs, Hogarth, Lessing, and Goethe are great in other ways. Meyer called himself a historian of art, but he was inferior both to Herder and to Hamann. From J.B. Vico to Immanuel Kant, European thought is without a name of great importance as regards this subject. Kant took up the problem where Vico had left it, not in the historical, but in the ideal sense. He resembled the Italian philosopher in the gravity and the tenacity of his studies in aesthetic, but he was far less happy in his solutions, which did not attain to the truth, and to which he did not succeed in giving the necessary unity and systematization. The reader must bear in mind that Kant is here criticized solely as an aesthetician. His other conclusions do not enter directly into the discussion. What was Kant's idea of art? The answer is the same in substance as Baumgarten's. This may seem strange to those who remember his sustained polemic against Wolff and the conception of beauty as confused perception. But Kant always thought highly of Baumgarten. He calls him that excellent analyst in the Critique of Pure Reason, and he used Baumgarten's text for his university lectures on metaphysic. Kant looked upon logic and aesthetic as cognate studies, and in his scheme of studies for 1765, and in the Critique of Pure Reason, he proposes to cast a glance at the critique of taste, that is to say, aesthetic. Quote, "Since the study of the one is useful for the other, and they are mutually illuminative." End quote. He followed Meyer in his distinctions between logical and aesthetic truth. He even quoted the instance of the young girl whose face when distinctly seen, i.e. with a microscope, is no longer beautiful. It is true aesthetically, he said, that when a man is dead he cannot come to life, although this be opposed both to logical and to moral truth. It is aesthetically true that the sun plunges into the sea, although that is not true logically or objectively. No one even among the greatest can yet tell to what extent logical truth should mingle with aesthetic truth. Kant believed that logical truth must wear the habit of aesthetic in order to become accessible. This habit, he thought, was discarded only by the rational sciences, which tend to depth. Aesthetic certainly is subjective. It is satisfied with authority or with appeal to great men. We are so feeble that aesthetic must eke out our thoughts. Aesthetic is a vehicle of logic. But there are logical truths which are not aesthetic. We must exclude from philosophy exclamations and other emotions which belong to aesthetic truth. For Kant, poetry is the harmonious play of thought and sensation, differing from eloquence because in poetry thoughts are fitted to suggestions. In eloquence the reverse is true. Poetry should make virtue and intellect visible, as was done by Pope in his Essay on Man. Elsewhere he says frankly that logical perfection is the foundation of all the rest. The confirmation of this is found in his Critique of Judgment, which Schelling looked upon as the most important of the three critiques, and which Hegel and other metaphysical idealists always especially esteemed. For Kant, art was always, "a sensible and imaged covering for an intellectual concept." He did not look upon art as pure beauty, without a concept. He looked upon it as a beauty adherent and fixed about a concept. The work of genius contains two elements, imagination and intelligence. To these must be added taste, which combines the two. Art may even represent the ugly in nature, for artistic beauty, "is not a beautiful thing, but a beautiful representation of a thing." But this representation of the ugly has its limits in the arts. Here Kant remembers Lessing and Winckelmann. And an absolute limit in the disgusting and the repugnant, which kills the representation itself. He believes that there may be artistic productions without a concept, such as are flowers in nature, and these would be ornaments to frameworks, music without words, etc., etc. But, since they represent nothing reducible to a definite concept, they must be classed, like flowers, with free beauties. This would certainly seem to exclude them from aesthetic, which, according to Kant, should combine imagination and intelligence. Kant is shut in with intellectualist barriers. A complete definition of the imagination is wanting to his system. He does not admit that the imagination belongs to the powers of the mind. He relegates it to the facts of sensation. He is aware of the reproductive and combinative imagination, but he does not recognize fancy, fantasia, which is the true productive imagination. Yet Kant was aware that there exists an activity other than the intellective. Intuition is referred to by him as preceding intellective activity and differing from sensation. He does not speak of it, however, in his Critique of Art, but in the first section of the Critique of Pure Reason. Sensations do not enter the mind until it has given them form. This is neither sensation nor intelligence. It is pure intuition, the sum of the a priori principles of sensibility. He speaks thus, "There must then exist a science that forms the first part of the transcendental doctrine of the elements, distinct from that which contains the principles of pure thought, and is called transcendental logic." What does he call this new science? He calls it transcendental aesthetic, and refuses to allow the term to be used for the critique of taste, which could never become a science. But, although he thus states so clearly the necessity of a science of the form of the sensations, that is of pure intuition, Kant here appears to fall into grave error. This arises from his inexact idea of the essence of the aesthetic faculty, or of art, which, as we now know, is pure intuition. He conceives the form of sensibility to be reducible to the two categories of space and time. Benedetto Croce has shown that space and time are far from being categories or functions. They are complex posterior formations. Kant, however, looked upon density, colour, etc., as material for sensations, but the mind only observes colour or hardness when it has already given a form to its sensations. Sensations, in so far as they are crude matter, are outside the mind. They are a limit. Colour, hardness, density, etc., are already intuitions. They are the aesthetic activity in its rudimentary manifestation. Characterizing or qualifying imagination, that is, aesthetic activity, should therefore take the place occupied by the study of space and time in the Critique of Pure Reason, and constitute the true transcendental aesthetic, prologue to logic. Had Kant done this, he would have surpassed Leibniz and Baumgarten. He would have equalled Vico. Kant did not identify the beautiful with art. He established what he called the four moments of beauty, amounting to a definition of it. The two negative moments are, "that is beautiful which pleases without interest." This thesis was directed against the sensualist school of English writers, with whom Kant had for a time agreed, and "That is beautiful which pleases without a concept," directed against the intellectualists. Thus he affirmed the existence of a spiritual domain, distinct from that of organic pleasure, of the useful, the good, and the true. The two other moments are, "That is beautiful which has the form of finality without the representation of an end," and "That is beautiful which is the object of universal pleasure." What is this disinterested pleasure that we experience before pure colours, pure sounds, and flowers? Benedetto Croce replies that this mysterious domain has no existence, that the instances cited represent either instances of organic pleasure or are artistic facts of expression. Kant was less severe with the Neoplatonicians than with the two schools of thought above mentioned. His Critique of Judgment contains some curious passages, in one of which he gives his distinction of form from matter. "In music the melody is the matter, harmony the form. In a flower the scent is the matter, the shape or configuration the form." In the other arts he found that the design was the essential. "Not what pleases in sensation, but what is approved for its form, is the foundation of taste." In his pursuit of the phantom of a beauty, which is neither that of art nor of sensual pleasure, exempt alike from expression and from enjoyment, he became enveloped in inextricable contradictions. Little disposed as he was to let himself be carried away by the imagination, he expressed his contempt for philosopher poets like Herder, and kept saying and unsaying, affirming and then immediately criticizing his own affirmations as to this mysterious beauty. The truth is that this mystery is simply his own individual uncertainty before a problem which he could not solve, owing to his having no clear idea of an activity of sentiment. Such an activity represented for him a logical contradiction. Such expressions as "necessary universal pleasure," "finality without the idea of end," are verbal proofs of his uncertainty. How was he to emerge from this uncertainty, this contradiction? He fell back upon the concept of a base of subjective finality as the base of the judgment of taste, that is, of the subjective finality of nature by the judgment. But nothing can be known or disclosed to the object by means of this concept, which is indeterminate in itself and not adapted for knowledge. Its determining reason is perhaps situated in "the suprasensible substratum of humanity." Thus beauty becomes a symbol of morality. "The subjective principle alone, that is, the indeterminate idea of the suprasensible in us, can be indicated as the sole key to reveal this faculty, which remains unknown to us in its origin. Nothing but this principle can make that hidden faculty comprehensible." Kant had a tendency to mysticism, which this statement does not serve to conceal, but it was a mysticism without enthusiasm, a mysticism almost against the grain. His failure to penetrate thoroughly the nature of the aesthetic activity led him to see double and even triple on several occasions. Art being unknown to him in its essential nature, he invents the functions of space and time, and terms this transcendental aesthetic. He develops the theory of the imaginative beautifying of the intellectual concept by genius. He is finally forced to admit a mysterious power of feeling, intermediate between the theoretic and the practical activity. This power is cognoscitive and non-cognoscitive, moral and indifferent to morality, agreeable and yet detached from the pleasure of the senses. His successors hastened to make use of this mysterious power, for they were glad to be able to find some sort of justification for their bold speculations in the severe philosopher of Königsberg. In addition to Schelling and Hegel, for whom, as has been said, the Critique of Judgment seemed the most important of the three critiques, We must now mention the name of a poet who showed himself as great in philosophical as in aesthetic achievement. Friedrich Schiller first elaborated that portion of the Kantian thought contained in the Critique of Judgment. Before any professional philosopher, Schiller studied that sphere of activity which unites feeling with reason. Hegel talks with admiration of this artistic genius, who was also so profoundly philosophical, and first announced the principle of reconciliation between life as duty and reason on the one hand, and the life of the senses and feeling on the other. To Schiller belongs the great merit of having opposed the subjective idealism of Kant, and of having made the attempt to surpass it. The exact relations between Kant and Schiller, and the extent to which the latter may have been influenced by Leibniz and Herder, are of less importance to the history of aesthetic than the fact that Schiller unified once for all art and beauty, which had been separated by Kant, with his distinctions between adherent and pure beauty. Schiller's artistic sense must doubtless have stood him here in good stead. Schiller found a very unfortunate and misleading term to apply to the aesthetic sphere. He called it the sphere of play, Spiel. He strove to explain that by this he did not mean ordinary games, nor material amusement. For Schiller, this sphere of play lay intermediate between thought and feeling. Necessity in art gives place to a free disposition of forces. Mind and nature, matter and form, are here reconciled. The beautiful is life, but not physiological life. A beautiful statue may have life, and a living man be without it. Art conquers nature with form. The great artist effaces matter with form. The less we are sensible of the material in a work of art, the greater the triumph of the artist. The soul of the spectator should leave the magic sphere of art as pure and as perfect as when it left the hands of the Creator. The most frivolous theme should be so treated that we can pass at once from it to the most rigorous, and vice versa. Only when man has placed himself outside the world and contemplates it aesthetically, can he know the world. While he is merely the passive receiver of sensations, he is one with the world, and therefore cannot realize it. Art is indeterminism. With the help of art, man delivers himself from the yoke of the senses, and is at the same time free of any rational or moral duty. He may enjoy for a moment the luxury of serene contemplation. Schiller was well aware that the moment art is employed to teach morals directly, it ceases to be art. All other teachings give to the soul a special imprint. Art alone is favourable to all without prejudice. Owing to this indifference of art, it possesses a great educative power, by opening the path to morality without preaching or persuasion. Without determining, it produces determinability. This was the main theme of the celebrated Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man, which Schiller wrote to his patron, the Duke of Holstein-Augustenburg. Here, and in his lectures at the University of Jena, it is clear that Schiller addresses himself to a popular audience. He began a work on scientific aesthetic, which he intended to entitle Callias, but unfortunately died without completing it. We possess only a few fragments, contained in his correspondence with his friend Körner. Körner did not feel satisfied with the formula of Schiller, and asked for some more precise and objective mark of the beautiful. Schiller tells him that he has found it, but what he had found we shall never know, as there is no document to inform us. The fault of Schiller's aesthetic theory was its lack of precision. His artistic faculty enabled him to give unsurpassable descriptions of the catharsis and of other effects of art, but he fails to give a precise definition of the aesthetic function. True, he dissociates it from morality, yet admits that it may in a measure be associated with it. The only formal activities that he recognizes are the moral and the intellectual, and he denies altogether, against the sensualists, that art can have anything to do with passion or sensuality. His intellectual world consisted only of the logical and the intellectual, leaving out the imaginative activity. What is art for Schiller? He admits 4 modes of relation between man and the external things. They are the physical, the logical, the moral, and the aesthetic. He describes this latter as a mode by which things affect the whole of our different forces, without being a definite object for any one in particular. Thus a man may be said to please aesthetically, when he does so without appealing to any one of the senses directly, and without any law or end being thought of in connection with him." Schiller cannot be made to say anything more definite than this. His general position was probably much like Kant's, save in the case above mentioned, where he made a happy correction. And he probably looked upon aesthetic as a mingling of several faculties, as a play of sentiment. Schiller was faithful to Kant's teaching in its main lines, and his uncertainty was largely due to this. The existence of a third sphere, uniting form and matter, was for Schiller rather an ideal conformable to reason than a definite activity. It was supposititious rather than effective. But the Romantic movement in literature, which was at that time gaining ground, with its belief in a superhuman faculty called imagination, ingenious breaker of rules, found no such need for restraint. Schiller's modest reserve was set aside, and with J.P. Richter we approach a mythology of the imagination. Many of his observations are, however, just, and his distinction between productive and reproductive imagination is excellent. How could humanity appreciate works of genius, he asks, were it without some common measure? All men who can go as far as saying, "This is beautiful," before a beautiful thing, are capable of the latter. He then proceeds to establish, to his own satisfaction, categories of the imagination, leading from simple talent to the supreme form of male genius, in which all faculties flourish together, a faculty of faculties. The Romantic conception of art is, in substance, that of idealist German philosophy, where we find it in a more coherent and systematic form. It is the conception of Schelling, Solger, and Hegel. Fichte, Kant's first great pupil, cannot be included with these, for his view of aesthetic, largely influenced by Schiller, is transformed in the Fichtean system to a moral activity, to a representation of the ethical ideal. The subjective idealism of Fichte, however, generated an aesthetic, that of irony as the base of art. The I that has created the universe can also destroy it. The universe is a vain appearance, smiled at by the ego its creator, who surveys it as an artist his work, from without and from above. For Friedrich Schlegel, art was a perpetual farce, a parody of itself. Antique defined irony as a force which allows the poet to dominate his material. Novalis, that romantic Fichtean, dreamed of a magical idealism, an art of creating by an instantaneous act of the ego, but Schelling's system of transcendental idealism was the first great philosophical affirmation of Romanticism and of conscious Neoplatonism reborn in aesthetic. Schelling has obviously studied Schiller, but he brings to the problem a mind more purely philosophical and a method more exactly scientific. He even takes Kant to task for a faultiness of method. His remarks as to Plato's position are curious, if not conclusive. He says that Plato condemned the art of his time because it was realistic and naturalistic. Like all antique art, it exhibited a finite character. Plato's judgment would have been quite different had he known Christian art, of which the character is infinity. Schelling held firm to the fusion of art and beauty effected by Schiller, but he combated Winckelmann's theory of abstract beauty with its negative conception of the characteristic, assigning to art the limits of the individual. Art is characteristic beauty, it is not the individual, but the living conception of the individual. When the artist recognizes the eternal idea in an individual, and expresses it outwardly, he transforms the individual into a world apart, into a species, into an eternal idea. Characteristic beauty is the fullness of form which slays form. It does not silence passion, but restrains it as the banks of a river the waters that flow between them, but do not overflow. Schelling's starting point is the criticism of teleological judgment, as stated by Kant in his third critique. Teleology is the union of theoretic with practical philosophy. But the system would not be complete unless we could show the identity of the two worlds, theoretic and practical, in the subject itself. He must demonstrate the existence of an activity which is at once unconscious as nature and conscious as spirit. This activity we find in aesthetic, which is therefore, "the general organ of philosophy, the keystone of the whole building." Poetry and philosophy alone possess the world of the ideal, in which the real world vanishes. True art is not the impression of the moment, but the representation of infinite life. It is transcendental intuition objectified. The time will come when philosophy will return to poetry, which was its source, and on the new philosophy will arise a new mythology. Philosophy does not depict real things, but their ideas. So too art. Those same ideas, of which real things are, as philosophy shows, the imperfect copies, reappear in art objectified as ideas, and therefore in their perfection. Art stands nearest to philosophy, which itself stands nearest to the idea, and therefore nearest to perfection. Art differs from philosophy only by its specialization. In all other ways it is the ideal world in its most complete expression. The three ideas of truth, goodness, and beauty correspond to the three powers of the ideal and of the real world. Beauty is not the universal whole, which is truth, nor is it the only reality, which is action. It is the perfect mingling of the two. "Beauty exists where the real or particular is so adequate to its concept that this infinite thing enters into the finite, and is contemplated in the concrete." Philosophy unites truth, morality, and beauty in what they possess in common, and deduces them from their unique source, which is God. If philosophy assume the character of science and of truth, although it be superior to truth, the reason for this lies in the fact that science and truth are simply the formal determination of philosophy. Schelling looked upon mythology as a necessity for every art. Ideas are gods, considered from the point of view of reality, for the essence of each is equal to God in a particular form. The characteristics of all gods, including the Christian, are pure limitation and absolute indivisibility. Minerva has wisdom and strength, but lacks womanly tenderness. Juno has power and wisdom, but is without amorous charm, which she borrows from the girdle of Venus, who in her turn is without the wisdom of Minerva. What would these gods become without their limitations? They would cease to be the objects of fancy. Fancy is a faculty, apart from the pure intellect and from the reason. Distinct from imagination, which develops the products of art, fancy has intuitions of them, grasps them herself, and herself represents them. Fancy is to imagination as intellectual intuition is to reason. Fancy, then, is intellectual intuition in art. In the thought of Schelling, fancy, the new or artistic intuition, sister of intellectual intuition, came to dominate alike the intellect and the old conception of the fancy and the imagination, in a system for which reason alone did not suffice. C.G. Solge followed Schelling and agreed with him in finding but little truth in the theories of Kant and especially of Fichte. He held that their dialectic had failed to solve the difficulty of intellectual intuition. He too conceived of fancy as distinct from imagination, and divided the former into 3 degrees. Imagination he held to appertain to ordinary knowledge, "which re-establishes the original intuition to infinity." Fancy, "originates from the original antithesis in the idea, and so operates that the opposing elements, which are separated from the idea, become perfectly united in reality. By means of fancy, we are able to understand things more lofty than those of common knowledge, and in them we recognize the idea itself as real. In art, fancy is the faculty of transforming the idea into reality." End quote. For Zolger, as for Schelling, beauty belongs to the region of ideas, which are inaccessible to common knowledge. Art is nearly allied to religion, for as religion is the abyss of the idea, into which our consciousness plunges, that it may become essential, so art and the beautiful resolve in their way the world of distinctions, the universal and the particular. Artistic activity is more than theoretical. It is practical, realized, and perfect, and therefore belongs to practical, not to theoretic philosophy, as Kant wrongly believed. Since art must touch infinity on one side, it cannot have ordinary nature for its object. Art therefore ceases in the portrait, and this explains why the ancients generally chose gods or heroes as models for sculpture. Every deity, even in a limited and particular form, expresses a definite modification of the idea. G.G.F. Hegel gives the same definition of art as Zolger and Schelling. All three were mystical aestheticians, and the various shades of mystical aesthetic presented by these three writers are not of great interest. Schelling forced upon art the abstract Platonic ideas, while Hegel reduced it to the concrete idea. This concrete idea was for Hegel the first and lowest of the three forms of the liberty of the spirit. It represented immediate, sensible, objectified knowledge, while religion filled the second place as representative consciousness with adoration, which is an element foreign to art alone. The third place was, of course, occupied by philosophy, the free thought of the absolute spirit. Beauty and truth are one for Hegel. They are united in the idea. The beautiful he defined as the sensible appearance of the idea. Some writers have erroneously believed that the views of the three philosophers above mentioned lead back to those of Baumgarten. But that is not correct. They well understood that art cannot be made a medium for the expression of philosophic concepts. Not only are they opposed to the moralistic and intellectualistic view, but they are its active opponents. Schelling says that aesthetic production is in its essence absolutely free, and Hegel that art does not contain the universal as such. Hegel accentuated the cognoscitive character of art more than any of his predecessors. We have seen that he placed it with philosophy and religion in the sphere of the absolute spirit, but he does not allow either to art or to religion any difference of function from that of philosophy, which occupies the highest place in his system. They are therefore inferior, necessary grades of the spirit. Of what use are they? Of none whatever, or at best, they merely represent transitory and historical phases of human life. Thus we see that the tendency of Hegelianism is anti-artistic, as it is rationalistic and anti-religious. End of section 22. Recorded by Lisa Reichert.